Chapter 17. The British Museum, London, England, June 3rd, 1889. Will had woken up in a lot of uncomfortable and, by most standards, bizarre places. Never, however, had he suffered a more distressing awakening than when, mid-morning on the 31st of May, he found himself being roughly shaken awake by a police officer, who was startled to find that Will was in fact alive, returning to his hotel on raw and bleeding feet in a stumbling, barely conscious state, which no doubt convinced the officer he was either drunk or under the influence of heavy opioids. Will had spent the last 3 days in a feverish haze, which had consisted, as far as he could remember, entirely of troubled sleep and gagging over the bathroom sink, his body trying desperately to purge the memories of May 30th from his mind. It didn't work, of course. Will could still see them. See it, perhaps he should have thought, for surely whatever he had seen was not human. The thing that was not sherbet, features stretched and contorted in agony and sheer defiance of existence. Every time Will closed his eyes, he could see the too wide mouth grinning at him, the empty silver void of the entity's eyes staring deep into his soul. Will wondered if he would ever sleep peacefully again. He had tried to burn the letter in the aftermath of the night's events. In fact, as far as he could recall, Will had left the nonsense letter on the pavement when the officer had woken him up. And yet, when he returned to the hotel and awoke from the first of many short and restless naps, he had found it sitting on the mantel, beside the melted and burned-out remains of a blue candle. That was when he had burned it, casting it into the fireplace, and then, when he awoke next, the letter had returned. Will had tried all manner of methods to destroy it as his mind slowly returned to cohesion, if not rationality. He had burned it and shredded it. He had cast it from the window and shoved it into vents. He had even attempted flushing it down the hotel's toilet. And every time, when Will awoke, the letter had returned, unreadable and unsettling as ever. Will wasn't sure what time it was exactly when he began his journey on foot through the fog-filled streets of London. It must have been quite early, however, as he had nothing but the dull pinpricks of light provided by the street lamps to guide his way, and as he finally arrived at the steps of the grand stone building, the sun had barely begun to rise in the distance. Beyond the towering concrete brick towers of London's skyline, the faintest glow could be seen, staining the smog in the air and the thick blanket of mist which clung to the ground in a deep, bloody crimson. Red sky in the morning, Will thought absently to himself, his mind barely registering the saying between frantic glances over his shoulder, terrified at the prospect of once again seeing the thing he had chased the other night, lurking in the shadows and pursuing him still. There was nothing there. No one on the street but himself. The entrance to the British Museum was looming and ominous in the darkness. A towering temple to empire and colonialism, built in the neoclassical style of its victims. Will half jogged, half dragged himself off the front steps. If it had crossed his mind, perhaps the explorer might have made himself more presentable before barging into one of Britain's most established institutions. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, at least in the places it wasn't matted to the sides of his head. His clothes, the same one he had been wearing on the night of his encounter, were crushed and wrinkled and stained with sweat. His eyes, red from exhaustion and fear, were ringed with dark bags. Will didn't notice, and even if he had, he wouldn't have cared. His mind was preoccupied with more important things. He had to know what was going on, what everything meant, why this page kept returning to him, and what this letter said. Will slammed against the door, which was thankfully unlocked at such an early hour, and stormed through the entry hall, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous building. "Excuse me, sir," an attendant, or possibly some kind of security guard, Will didn't bother to look, called out to him. "You can't be here." "I work here, damn it," Will shouted back. This was not entirely untrue. While not part of the museum's staff or researchers, the museum board did pay him a considerable sum for frequent detailed cartography of foreign locations, and of course for the collection of artifacts Will had attempted to source as ethically as possible. "I need to speak with Professor Jensen. I know he'll be here." "I really need to confirm with my superiors." "He is your superior," Will grumbled, shoving through a door into the twisting maze of offices and storage rooms. Wilton? Will yelled, his voice echoing in the empty halls. Wilton, are you in here? Will forged ahead on memory alone, which he soon realized was of no use. After all, he hadn't set foot in the museum itself for years now, and the names on the office doors were all new and unfamiliar. The walls, lined with portraits and bookshelves, mounted monuments to a tyrannical regime, were darkly lit in comparison to the grey expanse of the museum's entry. Although much of the museum itself had been converted, or at least was in the process of converting, to electric lighting, these back facilities still relied on gas lamps, and the dim lights flickered in their sconces, aggravated by a non-existent breeze. They flared up as Will passed, as if his presence were encouraging them to grow brighter momentarily. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he noticed the odd occurrence. Will jumped backwards as several books flew off a shelf in front of him, crashing to the floor with their pages splayed. He swore loudly, scrambling over the pile of books. As he did so, Will noticed a reflection in one of the mounted copper plates on the wall. The reflection of someone standing behind him. Someone tall and hunched, silhouetted by the light of the burning lamps. Will's stomach churned as he was flooded with the same feeling which had accompanied seeing that thing that was not sherbet. His head swam, and he felt as if he might be sick. Will turned around quickly, as if to catch the figures by surprise, only to find himself alone. The hall was empty, beyond himself and the mess of books. Will continued onwards. Will knocked on one of the office doors, slamming his hand so hard against the wood it hurt his knuckles. "What the devil? Stop that!" a voice called from the other side. "Staff or appointment?" Will hesitated for a moment, failing to fall into either category. He pushed open the door. "Wilton?" he asked, leaning his unsteady weight on the doorframe as if he were at risk of toppling over, which in all likelihood he probably was. "Dear God, William." Will smiled at his friend across the room. "Hello, Wilton, old spot. How are you?" Professor Wilton Jensen leapt up from his desk, almost knocking over the rather impressive leather chair behind him. Placing down his pen, the short man strode across the room. "What on earth are you doing here, my friend? I thought you were in the bloody Congo. You look dreadful. Are you quite all right?" Wilton hesitantly rested a hand on Will's shoulder to steady him. "I'm fine. It's complicated. I need your help, Wilton." "You look like you need a doctor, Will." Wilton led Will into the office and helped him into a chair. "Have you been sleeping? Whatever is the matter?" Will, trying to focus as best he could, forced his eyes to focus on his friend. "It's not important. I saw... There was this man, and... Were you mugged?" Wilton ran a hand through a mane of greying hair and adjusted his glasses. No, I don't think so. Not exactly. Wilton, that thing wasn't a man. I don't know what it is." "Are you quite sure you don't want me to send for a doctor?" Wilton asked gently, sitting on the edge of his desk. Will shook his head desperately and thrust the crumpled letter towards his friend, his eyes distant. No, I don't need a doctor, Wilton. I need you. I received this letter, and I need to translate it. It's urgent." Wilton raised a thin, pointed eyebrow. "I see. Will, surely with the amount of languages you know..." "It's not in a language I know," Will stressed, running a hand through his hair. "I've tried to read it, and it seems vaguely Latin, at least in some form of cultural basis, but other words seem cuneiform in structure, and I don't know. God, Wilton, I don't know." He buried his face in his hands. Wilton unfolded the letter, afraid Will would begin crying if he pushed any further. "Of course, I'm sorry." He glanced over the letter. "And you're sure this isn't simply nonsense?" Will looked up at the aging historian. There were, in fact, tears brimming in the corner of his eyes. "It's not. It can't be. If it's nonsense, then all of this is for nothing, and maybe this isn't even real, and..." Please, Wilton, it's incredibly important I learn what this letter said. My understanding of everything depends on it. The life of my friend quite possibly depends on it. Can you help me? Professor Jensen read over the letter a few times, his eyes darting fearfully between the scratchy writing and Will. He leant in close and squinted to read some of the letters, which were rushed and crowded together in an uneven script. I don't know, William. It's possible this is simply a forgery. I can't. No, hold on. The professor stood up, moving around the room. Yes, maybe. It's familiar in its structure. Fragmentary, I'll admit, but... He rummaged through a leaflet of index cards in a box on his desk before pulling one out. Wilton hesitated. What is it? Will asked, leaping unsteadily to his feet. Can you translate it? Not quite, but... Is this healthy, Will? Wilton looked at his friend. The cartographer offered no response, and he sighed. Very well. Follow me. He led Will out of the office and deeper into the archival wing of the museum. Standing below a series of deep shelves, lit by a lantern Will held anxiously aloft, Wilton pulled a pair of white cotton gloves from his pocket. I don't know if this is what you're looking for, he admitted, wiggling his fingers into the gloves. It's been a long time since I've looked at it. Before our trip to the Yangtze, I believe. Actually, I believe the last person to look at it was that friend of yours you referred to me. Randall or Raymond, was it? Ray. His friend's name crashed into Will's mind. Did this mean it was all connected to Ray? To this illness? Is that what the letter was about? It seemed too important to be a coincidence, and yet how could it be anything but? Yes, Will breathed. Raymond Morningstar. Wilton gingerly pulled a thick, yellowed scroll from a shelf and moved it over to a long table. It's Roman, I believe. Around 200 AD, we think. It was found a few years ago inside a temple somewhere in Egypt. Although, if my memory serves correct, it's merely a copy of an inscription found in Hegra in Arabia. Will wasn't listening. He watched intently as Wilton unfurled the scroll, parchment crackling as it was rolled flat. Their eyes drifted across the words, half worn away by the sands of time. He watched as Wilton laid down his own letter beside it. It took a moment to register, given the individual's poor handwriting, but... It's the same! Will laughed, the noise borderline hysterical. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. Dear God, it's the same! Thank you, Wilton, thank you. He wrapped the squat man in a hug, catching him entirely off guard. Oh, yes, of course, Wilton mumbled, pushing himself away from Will and looking again at the writings. Fascinating. To see such a dead and lost language being used so freely. I suppose it raises questions of lost sex or secret societies, if you believe that sort of thing. He ran a hand over his beard. So, what does it say? Will asked, desperate to run his fingers along the parchment, trace every curve and angle of the crisp black lettering. Not a clue, I'm afraid, Wilton admitted, shrugging. Nobody really knows. A few words have been translated, I think, but they're merely guesses. No one in our institute, or any other in England, has really bothered to try translating it. It's a curiosity, of course, but not exactly an important one in the field. Will's expression dropped. What? No, this can't be a dead end now. Is this all there is of the language? Wilton let out a soft, No, I believe there is more. Not here, of course. The original stone inscription, I think, had much more, but the site is badly damaged and not much remains. I believe there are quite a few examples in the National Library of France, ranging from pre-Roman to late Middle Ages, but most of it is fragmentary. And I believe that's why most of the translating was done too. This here, however, Professor Jensen gestured to the parchment, smiling proudly. This is the largest single fragment ever discovered. More of it remains than the inscription is copied from, if I remember right. We here at the British Museum have them beat for quality, if not quantity. Hey, old chap. He chuckled. Will forced a smile, trying to mask his internal screaming. Do you mind if I take a copy of this? He pulled out a notebook from his back pocket. Be my guest. Wilton looked at Will with concern again. This is really important to you, isn't it? Are you in danger, Will? Is somebody threatening you? What is this all about? Will hesitated as he copied out the text with shaky hands. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Wilton. He winced at the thought of the night in the hotel room and the figure in the alley. A shiver went up his spine. It's taken a toll on me, this letter. And I need an explanation. I need a reason. Will stopped writing. Thank you, Wilton. You've helped me a great deal here. Wilton nodded. The portly older man watched, shocked, as Will stood up and began walking away. Will? Where are you going all of a sudden? What could be so urgent? He jogged to catch up with Will as they left the storage wing. I need to pack. Will shook his head, pausing to let Wilkin step in beside him. Pack? Wilson asked, bemused. He led Will out of the artifact storage rooms. Pack for what? I thought you were trying to translate. I am. Translating, I mean. I need to go to France. Now, immediately, as soon as possible. Will grabbed Wilton's hand tightly and shook it vigorously. Thank you again. Truly, I owe you a large debt, Wilton. France? Oh, well, yes, of course, but... Will? Wilton asked as the explorer began to jog towards the museum entrance. Will paused in his tracks, spinning around to fix an intense and wild gaze on the professor. Yes? Wilton cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. Just... take care of yourself, will you? Will blinked at him. Oh. Yes. Yes, of course, I will. Thank you, Wilton. You take care too. And with that, he turned on his heel and ran out of the museum, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind him. Professor Jensen stood rooted to the spot for quite some time, baffled and terrified by the brief interaction with his dear friend, unable to truly process whatever had just taken place. God, I hope he's all right, Wilton muttered, slowly taking himself back to his office and leaving the museum's entryway empty. Empty, at least, apart from a lingering presence, visible only briefly in the reflections of the museum windows. The lights flickered and flared brightly as he left, before sputtering out entirely.